Welcome to the cinematic past, where empires fall, borders bleed, and forgotten wars become stories. April 9th, 1865. At Appomattox Courthouse, General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. In the American imagination, the Civil War ends here. A neat conclusion. A handshake. A nation stitched back together. But the war did not end for everyone. Hundreds of miles west, in the wide, contested space the United States called Indian Territory, the fighting was still alive. One Confederate general remained in the field. Still armed, still moving, still refusing to disappear. He was not white. He was Cherokee. His name was Stan Watty. Months later, he would become the last Confederate general of the entire war to surrender. That fact alone should force a different question. What did Native Americans actually do? During the Civil War, because the truth is not a footnote. It is not a side story. It is not a colorful detail in a larger white narrative. In Indian Territory, the Civil War was not simply Union versus Confederacy. It was nation versus nation, family versus family, old wounds versus new threats. It was a war fought on land that had already been conquered once by a government that promised the same people it would never do it again. To understand why tribes fought, why they fractured, why they took up Confederate gray or Union blue, the story cannot begin with secession speeches or battlefield glory. It has to begin with something far more brutal. It has to begin with the fact that many Native nations entered 1861 already running out of choices. Less than 20 years earlier, Native Americans had survived one of the most devastating events in U.S. history. Forced removal. In the 1830s, entire nations were expelled from their homelands under federal orders. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole were driven west into what became Indian Territory. Thousands died on the journey. Families collapsed. Councils fractured. The removal was not just displacement. It was a national catastrophe, remembered not as a policy, but as a trauma. By the time the Civil War approached, the survivors were still rebuilding. Farms had been replanted. Councils reformed. Towns slowly took shape again. The promise they had been given, that this land would be theirs forever, was the thin thread holding the future together. And then the United States split in two. When the Civil War broke out, Native leaders did not see an ideological struggle over abstract principles. They saw armies. They saw supply routes. They saw hungry men in uniform moving again across their land. They saw two rival governments demanding loyalty from people neither had truly protected. Federal officials urged Native nations to stand with the Union. But for many tribes, Washington was not a comforting symbol. It was the very government that had overseen removal. Treaties signed under pressure were not ancient history. They were living memory. Loyalty had not prevented loss before. And so the Union's appeal carried a bitter aftertaste. Trust us again. Then came the Confederates. Southern envoys arrived quickly, not only with words, but with geography on their side. Indian Territory sat directly above Texas and alongside Arkansas, too close to Confederate power to ignore. The Confederacy promised protection, autonomy, and respect for tribal sovereignty. They spoke the language of self-rule. They claimed they would treat Native governments as allies, not wards. But the most persuasive part of the Confederate offer was not the paper. It was the fact that Confederate troops were already nearby. Some Native leaders wanted neutrality. They argued that this was not their war, that they should not bleed for either side, that choosing would only bring disaster. And they were right about one thing. Any involvement would end badly. But neutrality required power, and Native nations had been systematically stripped of the very power required to remain neutral. As the summer of 1861 unfolded, the question for Native councils stopped being. By the time 1862 arrived, the war in Indian Territory was no longer a political dilemma. It was a physical reality. Armed units, many newly raised, poorly supplied, and only loosely coordinated, were already moving across land that had barely recovered from removal. What had begun as pressured alignment now became real combat. Confederate-aligned Native cavalry, drawn from the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw, rode north alongside Texas regiments, attempting to secure roads, river crossings, and supply corridors before Union forces could establish control. On paper, these movements were meant to stabilize the region. In practice, they exposed how fragile Confederate authority actually was. Union commanders in Missouri and Kansas quickly recognized that Indian Territory was not a sideshow. If it fell completely under Confederate influence, it would open Texas as a supply artery and threaten the Union rear in the Western theater. Federal columns began moving south, bringing the war directly into native lands once again. The first major test came in early 1862 at the Battle of Pea Ridge in northwest Arkansas. There, native cavalry fought as part of the Confederate force, charging Union positions across broken terrain they knew well. The fighting was brutal, confused, and decisive. When the Confederates were defeated and forced to retreat, rumors followed the smoke. Stories spread that some native fighters had scalped fallen Union soldiers, whether isolated acts, exaggerations, or propaganda. The effect was the same. The Northern press seized on them. Union officers hardened their attitudes. From that moment forward, many no longer saw native Confederate units as irregular auxiliaries, but as enemies beyond sympathy. The war in the West became less restrained, more personal, and more destructive. Pea Ridge was a turning point. Confederate momentum in the region collapsed. Native units that had been promised support found themselves retreating alongside white regiments that were already falling back. And retreat in Indian Territory meant exposure. Towns were abandoned. Farms were left behind. Families fled with whatever they could carry as the war began to move through their homes rather than around them. The illusion that native participation could be limited or controlled vanished almost overnight. After Pea Ridge, the war no longer followed clean lines. Confederate withdrawals and Union advances created power vacuums that native communities were forced to navigate alone. Authority fractured, law collapsed, and the conflict turned inward. Among the Cherokee, the political split became irreversible. Rival governments claimed legitimacy, each backed by armed supporters. Neighbors who had once sat together in council now rode under opposing flags. This was not symbolic division. It was civil war inside a nation that had not yet healed from the last one imposed upon it. Violence spread without formal battles. Armed bands raided settlements, accused of harboring enemies. Food stores were seized. Livestock driven off. Homes burned as warnings. Families fled at night, unsure whether the next armed group would arrive wearing Confederate gray, Union blue, or no uniform at all. For many Native Americans, the most dangerous enemy was no longer an outside army, but former allies. Old political disputes hardened into blood feuds. Elders lost control over younger warriors, acting in fear, revenge, or desperation. The fragile structures that had held communities together after removal began to give way. In mid-1862, Union forces advanced again, reclaiming much of the territory the Confederacy had failed to hold. But their return did not bring stability. Federal columns moved on, leaving behind garrisons too small to impose order in a countryside already hollowed out by war. Native civilians were trapped between shifting fronts with no reliable authority to appeal to. Those who could fled north into Kansas, joining growing refugee camps where hunger and disease spread faster than news. Those who stayed faced reprisals from whichever faction passed through next. The attempt to survive by choosing sides had given way to a harsher truth. Survival now meant enduring chaos. By the end of 1862, Indian Territory was no longer a strategic prize in anyone's plans. It was a devastated landscape. Fields lay empty. Towns were half abandoned. Entire communities existed as refugees on their own land. Native Americans were still fighting, still choosing, still adapting. But something essential had already been taken from them: the ability to control events within their own nations. What had begun as a war imposed from the outside had become something far worse, a condition of permanent instability that no victory elsewhere could easily undo. And as the larger Civil War continued to rage east of the Mississippi, the conflict in Indian Territory was about to enter an even darker phase, where alliances would matter less, authority would matter even less, and survival would become the only remaining. By 1863, the logic that had shaped the first alliances in Indian Territory no longer applied. The war here was no longer about choosing the right side. It was about staying alive in a land where authority shifted weekly and violence had become routine. Union commanders attempted to impose some form of order by raising native regiments of their own. Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole fighters who had opposed Confederate alignment, or who had fled north earlier, now returned under Union banners. On paper, these units were meant to stabilize the region, secure supply routes, and protect civilians. In reality, they deepened divisions that had already turned lethal. The war was now being fought by Native Americans against other Native Americans as much as against outside armies. The largest confrontation came in the summer of 1863 at the Battle of Honey Springs. Union and Confederate forces collided in what became the most decisive battle ever fought in Indian Territory. White soldiers, black troops from the United States Colored Troops, and Native units fought on both sides. The scale of the battle destroyed any remaining illusion that this was a peripheral conflict. When the Confederates were defeated at Honey Springs, their ability to contest the territory collapsed. Union control followed, but control did not mean peace. For Native civilians, the battle marked a transition from contested ground to occupied ground. An occupation came with its own uncertainties. As Confederate forces withdrew, many Native units were left behind without supplies, pay, or protection. Units dissolved into smaller bands, not out of ideology, but necessity. War became personal and local, fought over food, shelter, and family survival rather than territory or principle. This was the point at which the Civil War ceased to be a national conflict for Native Americans and became a permanent condition shaping daily life. As the broader war began to turn decisively in favor of the Union, Native communities were already fighting a different war altogether, one without clear fronts, clear allies, or any guarantee that victory elsewhere would bring relief at home. In Tisbakum, one figure refused to disappear. Stand Watie, a Cherokee commander who had aligned with the Confederacy from the beginning, continued fighting long after organized Southern control in the region had collapsed. His war was no longer about holding territory. It was about leverage, survival, and refusing to vanish quietly. Watie's forces operated as mounted raiders, striking Union supply trains, cutting communication lines, and dissolving into terrain they knew intimately. These raids were not symbolic. They forced Union commanders to divert troops and resources to protect routes in a region already stretched thin. His effectiveness earned him promotion to brigadier general, making him the only Native American to hold that rank in the Confederate Army. But rank could not change the strategic reality. The Confederacy was losing everywhere that mattered. Guerrilla warfare only deepened civilian suffering. Union retaliation no longer distinguished cleanly between fighter and non-combatant. Towns suspected of sheltering raiders were punished. Homes were destroyed. Food supplies seized. The line between war and survival collapsed completely. As Confederate armies surrendered in the East during the spring of 1865, Watie remained in the field. His resistance was no longer connected to victory. It was delay, an attempt to preserve bargaining power in a world that had already moved on. But the leverage never came. In June 1865, months after Lee's surrender, Stand Watie finally laid down his arms. He became the last Confederate general to surrender. The moment carried symbolic weight, but it changed nothing for the people who had lived through the war on their land. When the fighting stopped, Native Americans did not gain a voice in the peace that followed. They gained scrutiny. The military chapter closed. The political reckoning was about to begin, and that reckoning would not be shaped by how long they fought or how much they suffered, but by who had won. The end of fighting did not bring relief to Native nations. It brought federal commissioners, new treaties, and a reckoning shaped entirely by Union victory. When Confederate resistance collapsed, Native Americans were not treated as communities that had been trapped inside a civil war. They were treated as defeated participants. In the months after 1865, tribal leaders were summoned to renegotiate treaties under the shadow of military force. Previous agreements were declared void. New terms were imposed with little room for refusal. The logic was simple and merciless. Those who had aligned with the Confederacy had broken their obligations and would now pay the price. One of the first demands concerned slavery. Enslaved people, held by native owners, were emancipated, and tribes were required to grant them citizenship and rights within their nations. Morally, the demand reflected the outcome of the war. Politically, it destabilized governments already weakened by years of division and violence. Land followed quickly. Vast portions of Indian territory were seized or sold under pressure to the federal government. These lands were not taken because native nations had lost decisive battles. They were taken because the Union had won the war and now possessed the power to redraw the map without negotiation. Some native leaders tried to argue that their wartime choices had been coerced, that neutrality had been impossible, that their nations had been torn apart before any real choice existed. These explanations carried little weight. The post-war settlement was not interested in context. It was interested in control. Federal troops enforced the new order. Resistance was met with arrest, removal, or further loss of land. What had been presented as punishment for wartime alignment quickly became a broader campaign to consolidate authority over native territory. The war had ended on paper. For Native Americans, it had simply changed form. Violence gave way to legal pressure, occupation, and enforced dependency, tools that proved just as effective at reshaping their future as armies had been. There was one bitter irony. When the surrender documents were written they were drafted by Ely Parker, a Seneca officer serving on Ulysses Grant's staff. A Native American had written the final words of a war that had devastated native lands. The symbolism changed nothing. What followed was not reconciliation, but consolidation. Tribes that had fought for the Confederacy were punished. Tribes that had resisted or fled were pressured. Tribes that had tried to remain neutral lost land anyway. The war did not distinguish between their choices once it was over. Measured in actions, Native Americans had done almost everything the Civil War allowed. They raised regiments, they fought at Pea Ridge, and broke at Honey Springs. They raided supply lines, sheltered families, fled north as refugees, and endured occupation. Some resisted until the last Confederate general surrendered. Others returned in Union blue, hoping alignment would protect what remained. Measured in outcomes, none of these paths secured safety. By the early 1870s, native nations had lost vast portions of the land they still held at the war's start. Governments were weakened, borders redrawn, and authority increasingly dictated by federal officials, backed by soldiers who had learned their trade during the Civil War itself. The war did not answer Native Americans with victory or defeat. It answered them with exposure. Every path, loyalty, resistance, or neutrality led to the same narrowing future, because the power to decide outcomes had already moved beyond their reach. And so, when we ask what Native Americans did during the Civil War, the story refuses to fit into a single sentence. They fought when fighting was forced upon them. They adapted when survival demanded it. They endured a war that used their land, divided their nations, and then moved on. What they did was everything they could. What they received in return was a peace written without them. The Civil War is remembered as the war that decided the future of the United States. For Native Americans, it was also the war that proved how little control they still had over their own. The armies left. The flags changed. The pressure remained. And in that quiet, administrative aftermath, shaped by treaties, maps, and signatures rather than gunfire, the next chapter of dispossession began. Not with battles, but with paperwork.